Have you ever been in a situation or maybe had a day or a week where things just went really bad really fast? And you ask yourself, you're in like this bad situation, and you ask yourself, how did I get here? Like, how am I sitting here right now? One of my favorite little cartoon movies that we watched as a kid was Ratatouille. And if those of you who haven't seen it before, the movie starts out, it's about a little rat, hence Ratatouille. And the movie starts out, it's just showing this little window of a house, and all of a sudden the window explodes with a rat holding a book over his head, and it pauses right there, and he has a look of horror on his face, and then the narration comes over and says, "This is me." And there's been times where you've been in that same situation. You pause your life, so to speak, and you think, this is me. How did I get here? And then oftentimes a good book or a good show, it will start with, like at the climax of the problem, and then it'll go back, and really it'll just lead us up to what got us to this point. But here we kind of see in 2 Samuel chapter 11 a situation where David has to ask himself, how did I get here? Or someone from the outside looking in, us looking at David, asking ourselves, how did David get here? David does some really bad things in a short amount of time, and you have to ask yourself, David, the man who trusted God, the man who was faithful to God, the man who for the most part made the right decisions in his life, gets to a position where you're asking, how did he get here? I had one such situation. The night that Tucker was born was one of those situations where I asked myself, how did we end up in this situation? Of course, you know that we were looking to adopt our son. We met Megan and John, and we knew that it was going to be just a few months before he was born. So the night that he was born, we had gone down, Kara's sister Kaylee and brother-in-law Dylan were living in Bridgeport at the time. They were working at First Baptist Church down there. And we went down there because we knew they were kind of halfway between home and where we were going to have to go there in Oakland County to pick him up. It was around his due date. We decided we'd go visit them, wait for a couple days around his due date. And sure enough, we spent the day there. And at 9 o'clock in the evening, we got the call, Tucker's on the way. So we were as well. We got in the car. We drove down a couple hours to the hospital. We arrived at the hospital about 11 o'clock in the evening. This was April 6, 2020. This is the day where a lot of COVID restrictions came down and became in effect. All of those forced compliance things that we had opportunity to live through. And we knew that once we got into the hospital, if we had to leave for some reason, we were not going to be allowed back in. So we were kind of preparing, okay, once we go in, we don't know how long we're going to be in, we don't know where we're going to be, but we're not leaving until we leave with Tucker. So that's just kind of how it's going to go down. So we got there at 11 o'clock, and we hadn't gotten the call to go in yet. So we were thinking to ourselves, the next logical step, rather than just sitting here and kind of going crazy, let's go and get some things, supplies, so to speak, for when we go in there. So we went to a corner store, a corner gas station, and to call it sketchy would be being kind to the gas station. So I went in. Kara didn't want anything. Her stomach was in knots, but I was trying to think more logically here. I'm thinking, all right, I need to get something that's going to help us through the situation. So I got myself 2 triple shot Starbucks, like those big mochas, right? For some reason, not thinking straight, realizing that it's all milk. I'm lactose intolerant. That will come into play later in the story. Then I decided, well, I want to get something to eat too. And for whatever reason, I decided on this bowl of like habanero ramen noodles. And that was going to go really well with the lactose intolerance after I slammed the 2 Starbucks drinks a little bit later. So I get that. I microwave it in the little gas station place there. I go back in. We got a few other snacks as well. Well, 11:30, we get the call. We go into the hospital. They had no rooms. There was no room in the inn, quite literally for us. So we were waiting in a storage closet. There was a storage closet, maybe about the size of the platform, where they kept Kara saying, no, half the size of the platform. It was pretty small. It had one chair, so we rotated throughout the 24 hours that we would be in that room, sitting on the chair, the other standing or sitting on the floor. But it was with all of the, like the stands and like the whatever they needed for an infant. Whenever they were born, they'd run in and they would grab it. So there were people in and out, and we're just in there with these trays and everything. Anyways, so Tucker's born, we get him, and they just say, here's your baby. So we're looking at him, and they used some suction when he was born to bring him out. So we're first-time parents. We don't know what a baby's supposed to look like, really. To me, they all look the same. They're just kind of like a potato. Well, his head looked like a mini football because they had used it for suction, and Kara's like, oh, and I'm thinking, this kid have a problem? Like his head is not supposed to look like a baguette, like it's supposed to be round. And so we're as crazy. So then about that time, the habanero stuff and the lactose intolerance is starting to kick in. And we had him. It was great. 12 hours, 14 hours, 20 hours in the storage closet. We don't have a room. We don't have the ability to order food because we are not there in the hospital. We're in hiding with our child. So they said, well, you can avail yourself of the hospitality room. They had saltine crackers and mustard packets. That was it. So needless to say, we finally, after about 24 hours, they said, hey, we have you a room. You're able to get in. And we took a shower. We ordered food off the menu. You're hungry when hospital food tastes delicious. Chicken tenders and unsalted mac and cheese. It was awesome. But at one point, I was sitting in there in that room thinking, this is just a really odd situation. This is so crazy in so many different ways. How did I get here? David is in a situation where we have to ask, how did the man after God's own heart make some really, really poor choices, commit some heinous crimes in a very short amount of time? First, before we look at how he got here, first of all, we're going to look at what he did. I'm not going to take for granted that all of us know the story, so we're going to read the chapter. For those of you who skipped out on Bible reading today because, quote unquote, time change got you, it was fall back. You had an extra hour, so that doesn't count, but whatever. We'll read it anyways. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon, and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed, and walked up on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So here we're going to see the first thing that David does. He is going to commit adultery, not only with someone who was not his wife, but with one of his faithful colleagues, one of his good friends, wives. And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. And the woman conceived, and sent and told David, and said, I am with child. So obviously a little bit of time passes in order for all this to transpire, or her to let him know that this happened. So now he's going to try to create a conspiracy and a scheme to make it look as though this is not his child, he had nothing to do with it. Well, how do you do that? How about invite her husband home from the war for a couple days? Okay, I know our crowd. We understand that you do that and you figure, all right, he came home, she got pregnant. David sent to Joab saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah was come unto him, David demanded of him how Joab did and how the people did. Here we already see David just starting to become deceptive and sly. He's acting as though he cares how the battle's going. He doesn't care at all. He didn't ask him to come to get a report about the battle. To be honest, I'm guessing he could really care less. He just focused on covering his tracks, right? He's thinking, I have a situation that I need to make look A little bit different than what the situation actually is. So he's already starting to be disingenuous. Sin does that. You start to get into sin and you start to be two-faced and, oh, how's the battle going? Because he had to put on airs to make it seem as though he cared. And how the people did and how the war prospered. Verse 8, and David said to Uriah, go down to thy house and wash thy feet. And Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of meat from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and went not down to his house. And when they had told David, saying, Uriah went not down to his house, David said unto Uriah, camest thou not from thy journey? And why then didst thou not go down to thy house? David's thinking, this is foiling my plan. You're messing this up. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. Verse 11, this is what character looks like. If you want to say, well, what does Christian character look like? What does godly character look like? Verse 11, and Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go into mine house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As thou livest and as thy soul liveth, I will not do this thing. Uriah was a man of character. And he was a man, he could have gone to his house, he could have enjoyed some food, some pleasurable company with his wife, would have been well deserved. But he said, everyone else, all my comrades, my Lord, he's out there. They're out there fighting. They're out there in tents. I'm not going to go enjoy all the pleasures of life while they're out doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's character. So now David has to scheme again against Uriah, and he tries to make him drunk this time. Tries to get him inebriated, so he makes a poor decision. And when David had called him, and he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. And not even when he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his Lord, but he went not down to his house. Even when he was drunk at this point, a drunk man has more character than King David does at this point in time. So now, David sees that this plan is not going to work, so now he's got to modify the plan. Now, the plot thickens, and David's heart gets even more stone cold. He's going to send a message, literally the death message of Uriah is going to be delivered by his own hand. And here's what's sad. David knows that Uriah is such a faithful man and such an honest man that he won't open the letter and read the orders that David sends by his own hand to have him killed. That's the quality of man that Uriah is. That's the quality of man that David has the ability to know and to lord over, but yet David's just in a really bad spot. And it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. Verse 15, and he wrote in the letter, saying, set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. So now, not only is he sending the orders for an innocent man to be killed to cover up his sin, now he's involving another innocent man to scheme and give poor orders for another innocent man to be killed. It's just getting worse by the verse. And it came to pass, verse 16, when Joab observed the city, that he assigned Uriah into a place where he knew that valiant men were. The men of Israel had been in enough battles now. They knew enough tactics of war that they knew how to avoid certain situations, how to not get themselves in a pickle, so to speak. So Joab literally has to look at this battle in reverse order. He has to think, okay, how am I going to put my men in the worst position here so that Uriah can be killed? Can you imagine the pressure and the difficulty, the pickle that Joab is in? Verse 17, and the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, and there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite also died. Read verse 17 again. Sometimes we miss verse 17. I miss verse 17. Uriah is just one of the men that died. I always pictured when the order said, send Uriah out to the battle and then retire ye from him. I always pictured Uriah out there fighting, and then Joab calls the men back, and then Uriah is just staying there, guys, and then he just gets plowed over by the army. And it wasn't that way at all. Many men died. I don't know how many men, but many men died because of this. So David didn't commit just one murder. David commits an unknown amount of murders here. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, verse 17, and there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war. So now Joab has to give report back to King David that the deed is done. But he is going to have to send it by a messenger. Joab knows what happened. David knows what happened. The messenger, if he figures out what happened, you got a problem, right? Because you don't want the messenger to squeal on what actually went down. So Joab has to be deceitful to the messenger and say, listen, go and report to David that we had an issue in the battle, and that some men fell because I made a poor decision. And if King David gets angry because he said, why would you do that? You knew that if you made this tactic that it would be a problem. Then you explain it to him this way and make sure you tell him that Uriah the Hittite also died because of my poor decision. Notice it. And he charged the messenger, saying, when thou hast made an end of telling the matters of the war unto the king, and if so be that the king's wrath arise, and he say unto thee, wherefore approachest ye nigh into the city when ye did fight? Knew ye not that they would shoot from the wall, who smote Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast a piece of millstone upon him from the wall that he died in Thebez? Why went ye nigh the wall? Then say thou, thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So we're going to skip down a couple of verses. Now, the messenger is going to give report, just like Joab asked him. Look at verse 25. This is a stone-cold answer from King David when he finds out that his orders have been practiced and that Uriah is dead. Then said David unto the messenger, thus shalt thou say unto Joab, let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. Make thy battle more strong against the city. It would be like if today, tomorrow, let's say tomorrow, I'm sitting in my office studying, and Kurt came in and said, hey, Dave Lundeen was in a terrible car accident. He was killed. And I was to say, well, people die in car accidents every day. That's literally what David said. Well, the sword devoureth one as much as another. How stone cold is that? And we ask ourselves, how did David get here? How did the man after God's own heart, who really has a perfect track record up to this point, how does he get here? Here's another question. How do I not get there? Right? He finishes putting the nail in the coffin, so to speak, by marrying the wife of the man that he cheated, that he conspired against, and that he killed. Wow. How did David go from being in 1 Samuel chapter 16 a humble servant and a shepherd? In chapter 17, a faithful man that killed a lion and a bear with the power of God. Chapter 1 Samuel 17, he also, when he was running to Goliath, because no one else would face the giant, he said, I'm not coming to you with a sword and a spear. I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord. How did David go from the man who was faithful to the Lord for years and years and years while he was hiding from King Saul, from 1 Samuel chapter 18 all the way to 1 Samuel chapter 30 until Saul's death, where he's literally living and starving and hiding like an animal from King Saul? He was faithful to the Lord in all these different situations. How did King David, the man who was good to the 200 men who he left at the brook Besor because they were so tired from following him that they couldn't go into battle to try to save their own families from the Amalekites? How did King David, the man who mourned Saul, the man who hunted him like an animal, he mourned him for 2 chapters. That bridges from 1 Samuel chapter 31 to 2 Samuel chapter 1. How did the man who was patient after God said, hey, when Saul's dead, you're going to be king over Israel? Well, he wasn't king over all Israel. For 7.5 years, he was only king over Judah, while another man was king over all of the other tribes. He was patient. He said, Lord, if this is what you have for me, this is what you have for me. King David, who in 2 Samuel chapter 6 brings the ark back from the Philistines. King David, who in 2 Samuel chapter 7 wants to build a house for the Lord and says, I'm not okay with the fact that I'm living in a solid house and the Lord's tabernacle is in tents. How did 2 Samuel chapter 9, David's kindness to Mephibosheth after God had received kindness and a promise that Jesus Christ would come from King David's seed? How did he get in this position where he says, hey, you know, it is what it is. People die of war every day. Big deal. I don't have an exact answer for you, but I have a couple observations. And we're just going to look at them. I'm not going to necessarily preach them as Bible doctrine, but they're just some observations that I see in David's life, and they certainly apply to us. How did David get here? First of all, his position. Secondly, his second look. And thirdly, the cover-up. We're going to look at those things. That was the big groundwork. The message is going to be pretty short. This story takes place, it starts off in the very first part of the chapter where it says, it was the time when kings went to war. And I've heard it said and speculated that if King David would have gone to war, if he would have been doing what he was supposed to do, then he wouldn't have had this opportunity to sin. Maybe. It was oftentimes that kings would go to war with the men. Generally, the king would not be on the front lines. That's just a tactically not a great way to put your head guy in the front lines. But oftentimes he'd be maybe in a tent in the back or on a horse in the back. He'd be there to offer moral support. He would be there to encourage his men, maybe offer some tactical advice. But it was common that the king would be there, but it wasn't mandatory. And if King David decided he had other things that he needed to care for in the temple or in the city, he very well could have said, I need to stay back. So I'm not going to say that he was wrong for staying back. But because he was there, he had the opportunity to sin. And I want to tell you this, first of all, when we're saying, how did he get there? And we're looking at it from our perspective. How am I here, or how could I get there? Your position, where you are, can cause you to have an opportunity to sin. We say, well, where is that? Anywhere. Okay? You don't have to look very far to see that you have opportunities to sin everywhere and anywhere all the time, right? And we have to be careful where we are that we don't have an opportunity to sin. But I want to look a little bit more, break this down a little bit more. His position, he was here, he stayed in the palace while his men were at war. Maybe there's a couple reasons why he stayed. Maybe he stayed at the palace because of his newfound authority. He had been looking to be king for a long time. David had a new position as the king, and there were certainly certain benefits that he enjoyed as being the king. And we've all seen it from time to time, or maybe we've even been guilty of doing this. When you get a new position, or maybe you move up the ladder, maybe you get married, or now you become a father, you have a new position, and the quote-unquote, the power goes to your head, right? And we have to be careful of that. Or you see a coworker, they get promoted to a new position, and all of a sudden they're a totally different person. And you say, well, the power really went to your head. Maybe David was just enjoying the new ability that he had to be king. I want to tell you this, no matter where you are, no matter where you're at on the totem pole at home or on the corporate ladder, so to speak, everyone has the opportunity to sin. The Bible says in 1 Corinthians 10:12, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Someone wisely said, the best of men are just men at best. And we have to be careful that we consider ourselves, because just when we think we're good, that's when Satan can come in and give us an opportunity. So maybe David stayed back and was in the position to sin simply because he just thought, yeah, I'm the king, I've got some authority. It's not a big deal. Maybe he stayed back because of the comfort of the palace. When we get comfortable, we let our guard down, do we not? Think about, what does comfort look like to you? I don't know about you, but for me, it's in a pair of sweatpants, sitting on the couch, in my favorite spot, maybe eating some frozen mango, watching a show or something. It's a pretty vulnerable position. I'm not ready to go fight, or all my guns are in the basement. I'm not ready to go to battle. When we get comfortable, we get vulnerable. And it's important that we remember, Peter says in 5 verse 8 in 1 Peter, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. That was spoken of from a man who knew what it was like to feel like he was where he needed to be, and then very quickly lose faith and trip up and sin. Think about Peter when he was in the boat, right? And the wind kicked up. Jesus comes and says, don't be afraid, it's me. And Peter says, no, it's not. Prove to me that it's you. He has a lapse in faith. So then Jesus says, well, why don't you hop out of the boat? So then he has enough faith to hop out of the boat. But then he walks on water for a little bit. Then what does he do? Takes his eyes off Jesus, puts them on the problems that are around him. What does he do? He sinks. And that's literally a picture of Peter's life, up and down, riding the roller coaster of emotion, so to speak. Think about him. He said, Jesus, I will go with you to death on the cross. I'm never going to leave you or forsake you. Fast forward like 2 hours later, he's cursing and saying, I don't know this man. I never knew Jesus. We can get in the same spot. We get comfortable. We think, I'm good. I'm not going to mess up. Maybe King David stayed back, not because of his authority or his comfort. Maybe he was just tired. Anybody tired this morning? Any of you? Thank you. We have one honest person here. The rest of you are like half awake and just like, oh, I'm good. Like your eyes are closed. I'm not sleeping, I'm just resting. Okay. All right. How many of you are spiritually tired? Just why? There's just so many battles on every side coming at me, and it takes so much work to do what's right and to help my family do what's right and to do what I'm supposed to do and to come to church. It takes effort. I'm just tired of fighting. You think David maybe was tired of fighting? He had been shepherding his sheep and then fighting battles literally for 10, 15, 20 years. Maybe David just said, I'm going to take this battle season off. I need a vacation. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 was written by the Apostle Paul, who knew something about being tired, about being in difficult positions. He said, let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. The Apostle Paul had been shipwrecked. It wasn't like he was 2 miles offshore and he floated into the marina in a couple minutes. You're talking about near-death experiences. He was beaten. We talk about how Jesus was beaten with the cat of nine tails before he was crucified. And we look at that and we ought to as, wow, thank you, Jesus, for what you did. The Apostle Paul was beaten like that 5 times, the cat of nine tails. A flogging that was literally, that left your ribs exposed from the back end, and often people died because their guts and their lungs and everything fell out their back. Paul was beaten like that 5 times. He was boiled in oil. He was stoned to death. Paul knew what it was like to be imprisoned. It was not like the prisons that we have today where you get to go sit on a cot and watch TV and have 3 meals a day and it's nice and quiet. And for the dads of young children, prison sounds pretty good sometimes. And man, three squares, TV, and peace and quiet. Hey, sign me up for a couple of years. I'm joking. Paul was in a dump. He was in a sewer for years and years and years. Paul knew what it was like to be in a tough situation, but he said, don't be weary in well-doing. So how do we get there? First of all is our position. And it's important for us to understand that we can be tempted at any side, and we have to be careful. No matter where we're at, no matter where we think we are spiritually, the other two are going to go much quicker. The second look, it happens in chapter 11, verses 2 through 4. He sees Bathsheba, and she was very beautiful to look upon. Do you know that it wasn't wrong for David to see that? He didn't do, unless he went out there because he knew she was out there and he was doing it on purpose. If he just happened to go out, maybe he was thinking about something he needed to care for. He walks up onto his porch and he sees Bathsheba. He could have gone, oh my goodness, I need to go do my thinking somewhere else. I don't need to look at that. It was not wrong for him to be tempted. It's not a sin to be tempted. It's not a sin to be tempted. Jesus was tempted. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, for we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, talking about Jesus, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Isn't it in Matthew chapter 4 where it says Jesus was led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil? It better not be a sin to be tempted because Jesus was a sinner then, according to the Bible. It's not a sin to be tempted. It's a sin what you do with the temptation. And generally, we equate being tempted with sin because usually we just, oh, I'm tempted. And we fall right into whatever sin it was. We don't put up much of a fight against it. At least that's the way I am. Maybe you are way better than me. It's a sin to act on the temptation. It wasn't a sin for David to see her, but it was a sin for him to think about it. maybe to linger up there and watch for a few minutes, to send messengers and inquire about her, to have people bring her there. At this point, it's going to end poorly, right? We just know that that's going to end poorly. It was a sin for him to act on it. So where are you at? What do you do when you're tempted? When you have that temptation? When it's just boom, there. Do you look away, or do you take advantage of the opportunity to sin, whatever it is? And the thing that stinks is God says that we have an adversary who is seeking whom he may devour. He knows us pretty good, and he knows what things work to get us. And he is going to generally put those things in front of us. There are certain things that are not a temptation to me whatsoever. Those usually don't become much of a temptation because Satan knows that's not a big deal. There's other things that he'll use, and they're pretty effective, and that's why he keeps using them. So what do you do when you're tempted? Do you avert? Do you look away? Do you make ways? Do you actively seek for ways not to be tempted, or do you just give up and give in? So how did David get here? First of all, because of his position. Secondly, because of the second look. And lastly, because of the cover-up. And verse 14 kind of begins the precipitous fall of what David has done in his sin. Up until that point, really all he's done is commit adultery. And I'm not saying that that's not a big deal, but there could have been a lot less sinning involved here. What if David would have said, Uriah, I messed up. Here's what I did. I confessed it to the Lord. I got it right. I'm confessing to you now. I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? I want to make it right with you. I'll care for the child. I'll make it right with you financially. Of course, there's certain things that I can't undo, but would you forgive me for that? What if he would have just done that and Uriah would have gone back to battle, and we wouldn't really have the huge mess involving all these people and all these deaths and all this scheme and all this debauchery? But because David tries to cover it up, it gets a little bit worse and a little bit worse and a little bit worse. Have you ever been there? Or are you there now where you're thinking, I got to cover this up now, and you're just formulating these lies, and you're living a life that's really disingenuous at this point because there's so much covering up? James 1:14, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. There's Bathsheba from the porch. When lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth to sin. There's hey, who is she? Well, why don't you have her come to the palace? The sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. In this situation, literally, brought forth death. That's the message today. I want to ask you, where are you at? Are you the person that's saying, I don't want to get to that place. I don't want to get to a point in my life where I say, how did I get here? Maybe you're the person, you're looking at it maybe from the bottom up, and you're asking yourself, how did I get here? This is not a good situation. I don't want to be here. Are you there because maybe you got a little bit too big for your britches, or you got comfortable and you thought, hey, I got this. I'm not going to sin. Certainly, I'm a pastor. Pastors don't sin. Yeah, right. I'm tired. I just don't feel like fight. I don't feel like fighting anymore. I don't feel like saying no to sin. I don't feel like trying to do what's right. I'm just going to give up, give in, and whatever. Are you being tempted currently and you're getting weaker? And you're saying, well, that second look's starting to seem pretty good. And inevitably, I'm probably going to sin anyways. I'm under grace. The Lord's already taken care of it. What's the big deal? Or have you messed up and you're just digging the hole deeper and deeper and deeper, trying to cover it up? Where are you at today? I don't know where you're at. The Holy Spirit maybe said, hey, you're in a good place. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep following me. Keep your eyes on me. Keep leaning on me. And this is just a message of confirmation that helps you understand that, hey, I need to keep doing what I'm doing. But for some of you, this may be a message that's more of a convicting message, not a confirming message. And you're thinking, I got some work to do in one of these areas. I want to encourage you. Don't wait and say, well, it's not that big a deal. I'll just wait. He's almost done. He'll pray, and then, I'm off the hook. Because it's only going to get worse. Sin never, as it perpetuates, it doesn't get better. it only gets worse. The only way up is just to say, Lord, would you forgive me? Would you give me the strength to do what's right? You don't have the strength to do what's right. None of us do. We're fighting a losing battle. But when you incorporate the Lord and His strength and His power, we have more than enough strength to do what's right. There was a little boy, and this illustration I'm done. There's a little boy, his dad was a pastor. He was in Sunday school. His teacher was teaching him about Jonah and the whale. And the teacher was teaching, of course, how Jonah got thrown overboard. He was eaten by a fish, and 3 days later he was vomited up on land, and he lived, and he went and preached. And so they're in the car on the way home, and pastor asked his son, hey, what'd you learn in Sunday school? And he said, told him what he learned. And quiet for a minute, and then the little boy said, Dad, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that a man could live underwater for 3 days? And God said, the man said, if God was in it, then he could definitely do it. And the little boy sat and thought for a second, and then he said, well, I guess if you bring God into it, then that changes things. And that's true. And especially with temptation. You look and you think, there's no way that I can beat this or do what's right. And you're right. There is no way. But when, as a believer, you have the Holy Spirit's power inside of you, and God said you can do all things through Christ, now you have a fighting chance, right? More than enough power to do what you're supposed to do. That's what I have for you this morning. I hope that, and I pray that you would not just listen, but would you apply? If the Holy Spirit's speaking to you, would you listen to Him before it gets worse and worse?